Are we live?
Yes. Not live, but
Close
close enough.
Close enough. Ready for more? So we're moving ahead some 1,500 years after Augustine to the birth of, I guess, what we would call modern semiotics. And I don't want to spend too much time talking about context for Saussure. The course in general linguistics was published in 1916. Course in general linguistics. Saussure is a Swiss linguist, and he's practicing at a time when essentially what linguists did were one of two things. Either they studied historical linguistics, so that's a kind of almost historical, archaeological process, looking for the origins of words or trying to connect the genealogy.
Can you say the year again?
1916.
1916. And how do we spell
Saussure.
the author's name? Yeah.
There you can see at the top of the page.
Yes.
Ferdinand de Saussure.
Ferdinand de Saussure. Merci beaucoup.
Voilà. So we're dealing with a moment in the study of human sciences which is intensely positivistic, looking for specific empirical facts or features, the connection between languages, or the physiology of speech. So, in other words, speaking itself as a process that is understood to be equivalent to language itself. Shall we wait until? Okay. As long as he's not bothering you. So, again, empirical, physiological features, right? The process of speaking, for example. How are words formed? How does human physiology, anatomy lead to the production of certain kinds of sounds? This is an understanding of language that's intensely empiricist. Right? We're looking for facts. We're looking for language as an observable phenomenon. We can see it, we can hear it, or we can trace its history. Or we can trace its genealogy. So Saussure comes along and blows that up in the water and completely reverses and, in many ways, revolutionizes our notion of language. At the same time, as you'll see, he takes his model, his system, from the history of semiotics in the West, which we've already begun to trace in the first part of the class today. So, he's both deeply inscribed within the history of semiotics in the West, and in many ways is seen to be performing an intensely revolutionary critique of that same tradition. And so rather than, I want to get straight to the text, because there's a lot to cover in Saussure, and rather than give you a kind of very broad overview of Saussurean linguistics or semiotics, I think we let the text speak for itself, and that will give us specific moments little windows into what makes Saussure both radical as a critique of traditional semiotics, and yet, and in a way, ironically, by the very measures that Saussure adopts to distinguish himself or to reject traditional semiotics, those same measures only pull him more fully back within the very semiotics that he appears to be part of. So there's a kind of push and pull, a tug of war, a kind of tension within semiotics that the critic like Derrida will argue is part and parcel of all human science and all forms of semiotics. Okay, so a couple of points. First, language, says Saussure, is a well-defined object in the heterogeneous mass of speech acts. So when he says object here, he's asking the question, what is language? How do we define language in a way that gives us something that we can define and but he's already distinguishing between speech acts and language. Speech acts and language. And this is going to be an extremely significant dichotomy or distinction that we'll be hearing a lot about. The notion of, and critics who study Saussure tend to use the French terminology because, in a sense, Saussure is making that terminology his own and defining it in a very distinct way. Langue as language, and parole as speech. Okay? Speaking as opposed to language itself. Speaking the language. Parole as an utterance or a specific speech act. Okay? Some of these may be confusing at first, but just take note of them. And as we proceed, we'll be coming back to these terms, defining them, fusing them, revising them, and getting a better sense of why distinction is so crucial for Saussure. Now, look at how Saussure locates this, what he calls this object, which is language. He says it can be localized, you can see that there, in the limited segment of the speaking circuit where an auditory image becomes associated with a concept. Probably doesn't make any sense. And this is an introductory part of the text, and I'm just going to sort of let these words wash over you for a moment, and then we'll come back to all of these terms, and try to define them more clearly. But just hold on to those notions, confusing as they may sound. First, the idea that when we're dealing with human behavior, with parole, we're talking about a speaking circuit. So right now we're engaged in a speaking circuit. I'm speaking, it's reaching you, it's connecting to your brain, you're responding, you're understanding, perhaps you're saying something back, right? And so we're engaged here in a circuit, which is the very gesture of social speech. Okay? In the process of this, or in the context of this loop, this social circuit, we have what seems to be a confusion on the part of Saussure, because it's not an object, it's not one thing, it's two things. We have something called an auditory image. What the hell is that? We'll get back to that. An auditory image sounds like a contradiction in terms. Auditory image. Images are usually visual, not auditory. What the hell is he talking about? An auditory image associated with, very vague. What does that mean? Associated with, connected with, linked to a concept. Now, the word concept is the only word so far that we've heard that makes any sense to any of us. Even though I defy any of you in this room to define what a concept is. Anybody ready to give me a definition of a concept? You can probably give me a couple of synonyms. Can you hear me, by the way? Okay. I can't hear myself, so I'm not sure if I'm shouting or not, but it feels like I'm doing the right thing. Right? You can give me synonyms. You can give me idea, notion, fikir. You can give me different words in different languages. Anu, right? Idea, concept. But do we really have a very clear sense in any of this what a concept is? We'll get back to that. It's a word that Saussure uses in the course on general linguistics, but never really defines, which is interesting. It's a word that is deeply connected to the history of Western philosophy, of Plato, Aristotle, Hegel, Heidegger. The idea or the concept has always reigned supreme. Nothing is more valuable than the concept, the idea, the meaning, the signification. That's what we've been talking about since the beginning of since this morning. Truth as that concept, that idea, that meaning, which is originary, which is privileged, which is primary, is absolute, independent, stands on its own, infinitely valuable, the concept. And yet, it's central to Saussure's course on general linguistics, and yet it's never challenged, never critiqued, never defined. It doesn't have to. Again, it's one way of suggesting that despite Saussure's radical assault upon the history of semiotics, as traditionally been defined in the West, he's still very much part of that tradition. It's a tradition that, looking ahead, perhaps beyond where we'll have a chance to go today, it's a tradition that Derrida will later call, long after Saussure, about 50, 60 years after Saussure, in the 1960s and early 70s, will call logocentrism. Why not give you a little Derrida along the way? Logocentrism as Derrida's sort of shorthand terminology for that understanding of that tradition in the West which always privileges the logos, that puts the logos at the center of human thinking, behavior, and meaning. Logos, a word that is itself very difficult to define, can be translated variously as word, story, idea, meaning, logic. It's Derrida's way of referring to a persistent system in which what we privilege above all things is an idea that stands on its own, that somehow is for us more true and more real than what we have right in front of us. Okay? The logos. Now, so again, I'm trying already, even before giving you really a proper introduction, we'll do that in a moment, I'm suggesting ways in which there's already a kind of contradiction or tension at work in Saussure. So, he goes on to say that language is the social side of speech outside the individual, who can neither create nor modify it by himself. It exists only by virtue of a certain contract signed by the members of the community. The social side of this. Now keep in mind that this is at a time when linguistics was effectively the domain of physiologists and historians. And here Saussure telling us that language is something social. And when he says language here, he means knowledge. Translate as something like language, or grammar, or system. So I'm going to continue to add terms, words that we can attach to these different terms in this dichotomy here between langue and parole. So the emphasis had always been on parole, on human speech, on human behavior, actual behavior, based on the existence of a pre-existing language. So Saussure is telling us to shift our focus away from parole to langue. And if you think about it, this definition of langue as the social side of speech, as a contract signed by members of a community, is in a way a very commonsensical definition of a language. Right? We can speak Turkish because we agree to agree on the grammar and the lexicon, the rules and regulations of the Turkish language. Same thing for English, French, German, whatever language we choose to speak. Also, if you, this morning, it's not yet completely erased from your memory banks, it's not really that far from the way that Augustine defined language. That language, effectively, was a human artifact, a human institution designed to create vehicles for communicating with each other. So, again, something new and something old. Step away from traditional semiotics and yet a return to some of the central tenets, propositions of traditional semiotics. Now, already Saussure is beginning to, he wants us to question the empirical, the phenomenological, the physiological tendencies that were dominant in the study of linguistics. For example, number 2, where he says that language, unlike speaking, is something we can study. When we deal with speaking, we're dealing with individual forms of behavior. How do you speak? How do you form this? How do you form? When we study phenomena like that, we're studying individual human beings who are talking. And yet, what are we really studying? What are we really understanding the notion of language unless we begin to generalize, unless we begin to systematize, unless we begin to, in effect, fashion conceptually a grammar or a system to which all of us are, in some sense, participating by virtue of being speakers of that language. So I'm just throwing contradictions out of you. Think about the contradiction that there are no two people in this room who speak Turkish or English exactly the same way. Despite that, we have no trouble understanding each other. We agree that we're speaking the same language. The business of human communication is accomplished. And yet, no two people are actually saying things exactly precisely the same way. So what are we all doing? What do we share? What do we have in common if none of us are actually doing the same thing? So there's a real problem here in terms of the emphasis on observable phenomena, empirical behavior that we record and study, and yet this other thing that's somehow more nebulous, more abstract, called a system or a grammar. Okay? And he goes on to say, although dead languages are no longer spoken, we can easily assimilate their linguistic organisms. And again, it's something quite obvious. We all know this, and yet we don't think about the implications. We can study Latin, we can study Greek, even though there are no ancient Greek speakers speaking ancient Greek anymore. Of course, there are efforts by nerdy professors like me who get together with their friends and speak in Greek at coffee shops. But that's merely an attempt to revive something which no longer exists. Despite the fact, well, there are languages there are no more speakers of that language. Despite the fact that those speakers are not speaking, we can study that language, understand its grammar, read its texts. And if that's true, if that can be true of Latin, without ever hearing a word spoken by a Latin, that is, a Roman, then what is language again? Surely then, whatever is essential to language cannot be the physical sounds we make when we speak. Nor can it be some fetishized, originary language that we say, this is the true Latin, as opposed to some later version. I'm speaking again of historical linguistics, as again another dominant model of linguistics at this time in Saussure's career. Okay, so whatever language is, it's not speaking. It's not parole, right? Again, which we can translate various ways. Utterance, speech, speaking, saying something, behavior, using the system, as opposed to the system, the language, the grammar, the rules, what we often call language. One more. Now, again, keep in mind this is just, okay, I'm just hovering above the surface of this text. We're going to go over all these terms in a sort of logical fact progression as Saussure lays it out for us. He goes on to say, language is concrete, no less so than speaking. Linguistic signs, though basically psychological, are not abstractions. They are realities that have their seat in the brain. Okay, so, they're not abstractions. They are associations. We'll talk about that notion of association. Earlier already, Saussure has talked about a contract, an agreement that we reach with each other when we engage in the process of speaking a language. Realities, which have their seat in the brain. This is confusing also, because Saussure has been taking pains to define language as something collective, something social, something contractual, something communal, a speaking circuit. And yet now he's going on to say that language is a reality, or signs. We'll talk about how radically different Saussure's notion of a sign is from Augustine's. Signs are realities that have their seat in the brain. So just when we thought we were finished with empiricism, psychology, studying the human brain, it comes back in full force. Saussure can't help himself. He's a 19th century scientist. Okay, 1916. But effectively, he's a product of the 19th century. He's operating within that same sort of discourse that we saw in Freud, right? Who's looking for, who sees the process of studying of psychology as science, a rational, empirical basis. Saussure is part of that landscape. So he insists on calling the sign a reality. It's a very 19th century word, a reality, a truth, something which has presence, which can be studied, which has existence, and it has its seat in a place that can be localized and studied and operated on, examined, the brain. Okay. All right. Now, let's talk a little bit about what Saussure means by semiology. And let's see to what extent that fits in with what we've already been discussing and what we've already been learning about in the history of semiotics in the West. Language, says Saussure, is a social institution. Okay, we've heard that. A social institution, but several features set it apart from other political, legal institutions. Now, we've heard Augustine speak of, in a sense, the institutional nature of words. But we haven't really. What Augustine doesn't focus on is the system itself of this institution, which is a human social construct, as a system. And in that sense, Saussure points out, it resembles other systems with other rules. We can think of other systems, political systems, moral systems, gastronomic systems, driving systems, systems that tell us how to behave, how to play sports, how to conduct ourselves in public, the right manners to use. All of these are systems with rules. And in that sense, language is but one of a host of other human institutions that define humanity as a political entity. So this is interesting. So Saussure now is beginning to look at language and see it in the context of other forms, other sign systems. goes on to say, language is a system of signs that express ideas and is therefore comparable to, and now he gives us a series of other systems. A system of writing, which is interesting, that's seen as something distinct from language. A system of writing is its own system, which we'll see in some sense comes after language for Saussure, just as it did for Augustine, just as it did for Aristotle. Okay. Other systems, the alphabet of deaf mutes. Right? Sign language. A, B, C, D. I used to know that, right? Sign language, using your hands. Not so new for us, though, was it? Remember, we have Augustine already telling us this morning that we don't need any particular substance or material to produce language. We can use our eyes, we can use our ears, we can use our fingers, the tactile sensibility to convey ideas. So you can see the beginnings, the seed of this kind of modern semiotic approach already at work in Augustine. But Saussure is the first to systematize it and render it explicit in the course on general linguistics. Other systems, symbolic rites, various rituals, rituals of politeness, rituals of deference, rituals of political relationship, sporting events, right? Polite formulas, military signals. These are all languages as well. Saussure is the first linguist to take these systems seriously, to understand the human condition as being made meaningful and possible by a series of language, of systems, all of which in effect are languages. So whatever language is, it's beginning to sound like something much broader, much more comprehensive than simply stringing together words to form a text. If the rules of a soccer match or a football match can be understood to be a language, then we're approaching a very different notion of what language is. So whatever language is, it's what these systems have in common. Let's just take a moment to appreciate it. I know it's starting to much to say. Okay. So, what Saussure really begins to launch here, one could argue, is the beginnings of what we might call modern structuralism. Right? And one of the great developments that's made possible by modern structuralist thinking is the opening up, the revelation that human life is made up of almost an infinite number of systems, all of which can be studied as effectively languages, as systematic relations that make meaning possible. And that this is what they have in common with what we ordinarily call language, that is language as words, as grammar, right, when we use it in the traditional sense. So on the one hand, language is but one of many langues, one of many systems, one of many structures, one of many grammars. And if you look at the history of modern sociology or modern anthropology, we're dealing with structuralist thinking. The idea that we can study the way we sit at a dinner table as a kind of language based on certain rules. Fashion as a system that conveys meaning, that has signs, that has rules, that has its grammar. So on the one hand, language has been demoted. On the one hand, language has been demoted. It has been regulated to one of many systems of human meaning, right? On the other hand, he goes on to say that it is the most important of all these systems. So just when we thought language was demoted, it's re-promoted, right? Language is not, in fact, it turns out, just one of innumerable human systems for making meaning. Language is the paradigm, the model, the example for all the other systems to make. So we still are understanding meaning. We're understanding structure. We're understanding grammar through the model of, yes, spoken language remains triumphant. Spoken language. Consistently, critics point out, Derrida takes pains to point out, consistently, Saussure will relegate writing to its traditional status as merely a mechanism for transcribing, for notating pre-existing speech, which remains the model for human language, even as Saussure is telling us that that's not what language is. So there's a contradiction, in effect, a tension that's built in to Saussurean thinking that someone like Derrida will argue is inevitable. It's not that Saussure is wrong. It's not he's making a mistake. It's not that he didn't think it through. It's that inevitably there is return back to certain notions which remain persistent and are there, which precisely make possible movement forward, progression, even as it reinscribes us back in the ideas of the past. Okay. So what is this new understanding of language? And there is, despite what I've just said, there is a new understanding of language here. Semiology. All of these systems, rules of sporting events, rights of politeness, grammars of language, what all of them do share in common is that all of them are, in effect, sign systems. Rules that govern the manipulation, relationship of signs. What are signs? Signs are units of meaning. And they only are units of meaning within a system, which is to say, in relationship to each other. And he goes on to say that right here. A science that studies the life of signs within society is conceivable. That studies the life of signs. So Saussure is the first modern critic to approach language as one of a series of sign systems, and therefore making it possible to see linguistics as merely a subdivision of semiotics. In other words, linguistics would be that part of semiotics which studies what we traditionally call language, which linguists study today. But the larger overarching master discipline, that's what I'm saying, that master discipline would be semiotics, or what Saussure calls semiology. Nothing's ever simple in Saussure, in the semiotic world. Because Saussure goes on, just as he's apparently defined a clear hierarchical sort of chain, he goes on to define it and trouble a bit, to confuse precisely this hierarchy. This science would be part of something larger. I thought we were done. Called social psychology. Social psychology? Really? Yeah. Social psychology. I shall call it semiology, from the Greek semion, son. Look how even there is that, the classicist in Saussure, the empiricist. It's important to connect the terminology to the Greek and the Latin, the traditional foundation of human knowledge in the West, right? Giving it that kind of, that pedigree, that genealogy that ties it to the classical past and all of the philosophical presuppositions that are part of that tradition. Semiology would show what constitutes signs, what laws govern them. Since the signs does not yet exist, it's a kind of utopian project here, a limit notion that Saussure is offering us here. No one can say what it would be, but it has a right to existence. This is the radical, the revolutionary Saussure speaking out, right? The utopian project, right? A place staked down in advance. Linguistics is only a part of the general science of semiology. The laws discovered by semiology will be applicable to linguists, and the latter will circumscribe a well-defined area within the mass of anthropological facts. Linguistics now subordinated to a larger anthropological study, a study of human behavior and systems that make meaning possible. And yet, there's that annoying psychology which keeps getting in the way. Here we are, in the one breath, talking about society, talking about collective social agreement, and yet we get back to the notion of psychology. I'm not even sure exactly what Saussure means by social psychology, but he goes on to say that to determine the exact place of semiology is the task of the psychologist. The psychologist. Why the psychologist? I think it's the return within Saussure, the persistent, inevitable return of the mind, the domain of thinking, of ideas, of concepts, as that which must triumph, as that which must be at the top of the chain, as the originary, true locus of identity and meaning. Right? Think about it. We exchange meanings. We're engaged in a social, collective, speaking circuit. And yet, what we're still doing is exchanging ideas. I have an idea, I say something, it goes into your mind, you understand it, it's in your mind. You think of it, you respond, you speak to me. I mean, in the end, we're still dealing with, in a way, the traditional notion in which language is a vehicle for conveying ideas, the life of the mind, the spirit. Thought as the seat of identity, that which has true existence, true identity, that stands on its own, right? The mind. Another, or one way we might talk about that is, this is another way of understanding the logos. Right? Logos as the idea. The thought which can stand on its own and which has a reality in and of itself, an object which has existence, which has presence. In and of itself. Derrida has another term which I think is useful. It's helpful just to think ahead of past Saussure times. Derrida talks about the history of philosophy in the West, as what he calls the metaphysics of presence. The metaphysics of presence. Metaphysics, that branch of philosophy, right? One of the major three traditional branches of philosophy. Epistemology, we talked about this morning. Ethics, metaphysics. Metaphysics as the question that asks, the branch of philosophy that asks, what is there? What is this? What exists? What is the true nature of reality? Right? Silly little questions like that. We think about all the time, right? And Derrida's point has been that from the earliest efforts to think metaphysically, what has always counted, what has always been the persistent strategy, the inevitable strategy in the West has been to focus on, to search for that object, that substance, which has true reality, presence on its own, an empirical fact, an object. Whether it's thought, whether it's God, whether it's atoms, whether it's being. Right? These are all candidates in a long list of efforts to discover the basis of reality, the metaphysical, fundamental ingredient which makes the universe what it is. And it's been important that that idea of presence as the mark of that which is real and that which is true. For example, meaning. Meaning which can stand on its own, which exists, which has reality. In many ways, what Saussure will be doing, we'll see, is challenging that very notion of a metaphysics of presence by showing us effectively that it's, in the end, impossible to locate meaning anywhere in particular. I know that sounds impossible. And yet that's exactly what Saussure will be trying to do. He's both critiquing the metaphysics of presence and yet in some sense returning and re-sustaining that notion, even as he's attacking it. Okay. How does he do this? Well, let's begin, as we like to, at the beginning. The real beginning, the true beginning, by talking about Saussure's, and this is perhaps the most famous page of Saussure's course in general linguistics, where he talks about the nature of the linguistic sign. Some of you, have you seen this page before? How many people have seen this page before? Okay, some of you haven't. Okay. You can never look at it too many times. Those of you who haven't seen it, well, welcome. Okay. Now, helpfully, Saussure begins with what he sees as some of the traditional sort of unthought through, unthought out notions of language. By saying, look, most of us simply take for granted that language is effectively a list of names, a list of words, right? The dictionary. The dictionary is the model for our understanding of grammar. Should be the grammar book, but it's the dictionary, right? I mean, isn't that enough? It's a book of words. What else do we need? We've got all the words there. What more do we need? But as anyone knows who's tried to learn a language on their own, you can have the best dictionary in the world. It'll never teach you how to speak a language. You may know a lot of words, but what do you do with them? So the idea that language is simply a list of names, a list of words, each corresponding to the things it names. And this is then the traditional notion of language, right? And Saussure is using images here to refer to the object that exists, the cow that's out there being a cow, a cup of coffee being a cup of coffee, a tree being a tree, a horse being a horse, a dog just trying to be a dog. Don't blame the dog. So, and then we have a name that names it. Right? So it's what we call a nomenclature, a list of names that is attached to things. Saussure will disagree with this notion, and what he finds most seriously lacking about this notion is first that it's very vague about the way that words are connected to things. And Saussure argues that, or it takes for granted, it seems to assume that both the things that are being named and the names that are used to name them are, in effect, ready-made, pre-existing objects. So there's a name there, and we just attach it to a thing, as if the thing is just waiting to be named. But different cultures and different languages have different things that they consider to be things. And Saussure is going to revise our notion of language to suggest that neither things nor words are simply pre-existing or God-given. They are themselves abstractions, determinations, what he calls articulations, a way of dividing up reality and a way of dividing up sound and then bringing them together to form language. Okay? This is what he means by the auditory image. Get back to that auditory image and the concept brought together. He's going to clear out what he sees as the inconsistencies and the vagaries, the ambiguity of this notion. He's going to try to be as precise as he can about the process by which what he calls auditory images are linked to ideas. Here's how he begins to move forward. Here's how he begins to move forward. Saussure says, we have seen, in considering the speaking circuit, that both terms involved in the linguistic sign are psychological and are united in the brain by an associative bond. This point must be emphasized. Kids should be emphasized. I'm going to emphasize it. He wants us to emphasize it. He says this point must be emphasized, so I'm emphasizing it. An associative bond. Something is linked with something else. But where is it being linked? Well, it's being linked every time you understand something that I'm saying. Every time you hear a word and that word makes sense to you, you are in effect, or your brain is in effect, reestablishing the link between a word and the thing it names, between an auditory image and a concept. Okay? A subplot. There's always a subplot when you're teaching a class. It's never just, there's always something else going on that sort of creates a counterpoint to the authoritarian discourse of the teacher, right? There's a serious business of learning going on, but there's always another story that somehow is pulling us in another direction.
Can you repeat a bit about the psychological part and the bond?
I mean, this is why Saussure has been emphasizing psychology, is that he's arguing that even if language is ultimately something social, something collective, a contract that in effect we share by virtue of learning a grammar, still the terms of that contract are renewed, reassociated, reactivated every time we speak, in your brain, in my brain, in everybody's brain. And in a way, that's a helpful reminder that despite Saussure's attempts to define language as something collective, as something social, he's reminding us that we're still dealing ultimately with human beings that are speaking, that are thinking, that have brains. So he doesn't want to erase human beings from the picture. He's still studying, in effect, the human brain. And he's reminding us that ultimately the terms of the contract that is language is renegotiated in human brains. Right now, I'm thinking, I'm hearing ideas, I'm speaking those ideas, and hopefully those ideas are reaching your brain, you're processing them, you're understanding them. Right? Our brains are still operative, are still doing the work. Right? Without human beings speaking, in effect, either now or in the past, there would be no language. Right? Even Latin, which is no longer spoken, was spoken by people who had brains. And who did the same thing we're doing now, only they were doing it in Latin. Right? Okay? Makes sense? Okay. But Saussure is anticipating these questions and goes on to make his point more clear. And here's his first really explicit effort to redefine the terms of the sign in relationship to traditional linguistics. Okay, next paragraph. The linguistic sign unites. What does it unite? Right? It unites not a thing and a name, but a concept and a sound image, an auditory image, an acoustical image. Okay, I know that one still gives everybody trouble. But we're going to try to make sense of it. But think about it. I mean, when you begin to think about it, it makes perfect sense. It's the kind of thing we don't think about because we're using language at every moment of the day. We don't have time to think about it. Right? But how could language unite a thing and a name? A thing? Does language really depend on things? Do we need things to talk about? Talk about things? Do we need the things we talk about to talk about those things? Of course not. If I want to talk to you about a tree, do I need a tree here in the room to point to? Are we talking about that kind of deixis, that kind of demonstration, that kind of pointing, that kind of indexicality? Of course not. We don't need things. We don't need things. We need ideas. We need concepts. I can talk to you about Paris. I don't have to show you. I don't have to take you to Paris, much as I would love to. If I had my own private jet, we could all go to Paris. You see, there's Paris. I say, voila, Paris. But we could talk about Paris. We can have a very pleasant conversation about Paris without ever going to Paris. We don't need Paris. We only need the concept of Paris. And by the way, none of us in this room have the same concept of Paris. Some of us are now seeing the Eiffel Tower. Some of us are thinking about Notre Dame. Some of us are thinking about rude French people. Some of us are thinking about bakeries, little kids running around the street with baguettes under their arms. We all have different concepts. And yet, somehow we're able to have a conversation about Paris in which it essentially seems to make sense. So, this is the kind of thing that Saussure is trying to get at here. Not a name and a thing, but a concept and a sound image. Okay, we're comfortable with the idea of a concept. Not that we have any idea, by the way, what a concept is. It's one of those things that's awfully difficult to define and has been since Plato on, right? But okay, Saussure seems to be comfortable with it. And so let's give him the benefit of the doubt here. Now, what about this annoying, strange, pesky term, sound image, which has been variously defined as sound image, acoustical image, depends on the translation,
Auditory image.
auditory image. All the same thing, really. Why this recourse to these rather clumsy hybrid terms? He tells us. The latter, this sound image, is not a material sound, a purely physical thing, but the psychological imprint of the sound, the impression that it makes on our senses. Now we're getting somewhere. I don't know where we're getting, but we're getting somewhere, right? The sound image is sensory. And if I happen to call it material, it is only, in that sense. And by way of opposing it to the other term of the association, the concept which is generally more abstract. Okay. Everything that is, almost everything that's important about Saussure and frustrating about Saussure is there in that paragraph. But do you see the difference here? Do you see the distinction? Even Augustine already defined the mechanism of learning that is operating in the sign as moving beyond the impression made by the senses. So in order for us to have a sign, in order for a sign to be a sign, it's important that there is a sensory element. Our senses are involved. And the senses have been the obstacle for metaphysical thinking since Plato. How to get past the senses to the idea, right? Plato's world, binary universe, the sensible realm, the intelligible realm. Not the sensible like commonsensical, practical. The sensible realm, the realm of the senses, trapped by our senses. And the effort to think beyond the senses to what Plato calls the world of ideas, the realm of forms, the intelligible realm. We're still back in that same conflict here in Saussure. So we require, in order for a sign to function as a sign, I think you'll agree, the senses must be in play. Right? If there's nothing to see, if there's nothing to hear, if there's nothing to feel, if there's nothing to smell, well, nothing happens. No signification can occur. The process of signification, which we might call semiosis, can't occur. The senses must be involved. But that's different than saying that we need something material. And that's a tricky distinction to keep in mind, but you have to keep that distinction in mind. Right? To say that the sign is material would imply that there is something specific, a substance that permits signification. As if you had this ingredient called signifying ingredient. Like, I just throw it out and suddenly meanings occur. There is no particular substance. There is no particular material that is necessary for the business of semiosis to occur. What you need is some kind of sensory mechanism that's activated. Yeah.
How about intuition?
Intuition. I'm not sure that it would even register in Saussure's vocabulary. What do you, when you say intuition, I mean, because it's a tricky term. What do you, is there another word that you
I'm not
could?
quite sure on
Yeah.
Aristotle, because that's a stumbling block, but it is theory of sensibility. And
Right.
so I was just interested in
No, but I'd like to know how Aristotle uses it, and then we can that might give us a kind of an argument, in effect,
Yeah,
an implicit one that we could then we could submit to Saussure, as it were. I mean, I like that term, the notion that there's something inward dwelling already, as opposed to something. I mean, the point that Saussure wants to make here is that the sign involves two things, not one. And that was the good part of things and names. At least things and names involve two things joined together. One of those things is entirely abstract. And that, again, is where things get difficult. Because it's the same, it's essentially a return to the old idea that's dominant since Plato, that what is truly important about human thinking is ideas. And what is an idea? What's it made of? What's it weigh? What's it look like? What color is it? Where is it? Where are ideas? We're not really much better at answering that question today than we were in 5th century BC Athens and the Academy of Plato. And yet here we have, in a sense, Saussure returning to those entrenched and dominant authoritative terms. The concept, which he says is more abstract, less sensory. And if you know anything about Western philosophy, you'll know that when you call something less sensory, when you call something less material, that's a good thing. That means it's higher, it's more real, it's more valuable. Right? By calling the other part of the sign, the sound image, by calling it more sensory, he's pulling it down. Right? Remember, that's precisely what we need to get past in order to make sense out of things, in order to make meaning out of things. We have to return to the concept. Okay, so here we have it. He gives a little, in case you're not convinced yet about what sound image means, the example he uses now in the next paragraph, a favorite example, familiar example, all of this. Imagine talking to yourself. I don't mean, going in the corner of the room and going, I don't mean like that kind of behavior. I mean just have a conversation in your mind. Say a word to yourself without even moving your lips. I thought of cake, because I just had some cake. It's pretty good. So I was remembering that cake that I had. Now, when I said the word cake, I in effect said it without saying it. I heard the echo in my mind. At the same time, I was thinking, cake, good. The thing cake, the concept cake, the taste of cake. I remembered that as well. In other words, the signification of cake, what cake meant to me. It meant the experience of eating cake. And at the same time, I was conscious of the word cake, which was echoing in the echo chamber of my mind. We've all had this experience, right? You hear a song, and maybe then the next day you're hearing that song in your head, you're remembering it. You don't actually have to sing it out loud to remember that song. You can hear it in your head. That's a fact. That's a psychological fact. It's a psychological, physiological reality. So this is why Saussure prefers the notion of a sound image or an auditory image. He's suggesting that we don't need actual speech for language to occur. Signification does not depend on magical sounds, without which meaning is not being registered. We can remember words, we can use words, we can think in words, and these are in effect impressions in the mind, sound images. So he uses the word sound image to suggest that it's not sound per se. What Saussure is trying to do is trying to continue to reject the elevation of sound as the essential definition of language. Because he's just finished telling us that there are plenty of languages that don't involve sound. plenty of systems of meanings and rules that don't involve sound. So even in human language, the kind of language we speak when we're ordinarily speaking language as it's generally defined, we don't need sound. We don't need sound. Instead, we have the image of a sound, the impression of a sound. This is what he's getting at when he says sound image. Is, in effect, a kind of metaphorical language. He's using a kind of poetic license to suggest that what's important is not sound per se, sound in and of itself, but an impression, a recollection, an echo, an image of that sound. Yeah.
So I'm saying that sound image is just any kind of external input that affects our mind through our senses.
An external input, is that what you said?
Yes.
It begins with an external input. You're absolutely right. So we need a catalyst. We need, to go back to that notion of intuition, we need extuition. I don't know if that's a word, I'm just making that up. We need something external. We need an external catalyst. But that catalyst is not language itself. Remember I said earlier that none of us in this, we can take any word, any language, okay, it's a good one, we can all say it, none of us will say it precisely the same way. And the fact that none of us will say that word precisely the same way, and yet succeed in communicating with each other, succeed in the business of semiosis, of signification, is proof that no particular sound is necessary for meaning to occur. We don't need any one. So sound itself is not what's necessary for the business of meaning to occur. Derrida has another helpful term. So I find it helpful to sort of fast forward to Derrida in this way, who's great at penning neologisms and catch terms, new terms for sort of coining what he sees as currents or tendencies in the philosophical tradition. And Derrida will talk about something that he calls not just logocentrism, right, the dominance of the idea or the concept in Western philosophy, but what he calls phonocentrism. Phonocentrism. Phono from voice, right? From spoken, right? So the idea that in Western culture, consistently and apparently inevitably, the spoken voice has always been elevated, or the sound, speech, has always been elevated as that which is seen as closest to the idea, closest to the living source of meaning, the mind, whether it's mind or whether it's God or whether it's the concept or whether it's the form, right? Voice is as close as we can get to that originary meaning, that living thing which is mind or spirit or whatever we want to call it, what Saussure continues to refer to as the concept. Okay, so Saussure now comes up with this famous diagram of the linguistic sign. And what's interesting about this is that this is in effect unlike any other diagram, schematic mapping of the sign that we've seen before. Because it's not a picture of something at all. What is it a picture of? It's a picture of, well, at least two things. Well, perhaps three things. What I mean by that is, I don't mean to sound cryptic, I mean we have here the sound image, and we have those dynamic arrows which suggest the relationship between those two things. A third thing. Right? This is not a diagram, a drawing of any one thing. So it becomes increasingly now difficult, problematic, to point to the sign and say, aha, here's where meaning is located. Here's where meaning is. Is it in the concept? Well, no, because the concept without a sound image is nothing. We need to call it something. We need to speak it somehow. We need to say it somehow. We need to write it somehow. We need to communicate it somehow. But likewise, without the concept, the sound image is just noise. Right? They go, bleh. I haven't really said anything. I've just made noises. So bleh doesn't produce meaning, is not signifying. Right? So we need these things, and we need the relationship between these things. So this is the kind of diagram that tries to convey what Saussure is suggesting by the concept of association, relationality. That it's the relationship between two things that produces meaning, not any one thing. So this is an important critique, an attack on what Derrida would call the metaphysics of presence. Because what is present here? Where is meaning present? Difficult to say in this kind of diagram. Beautifully simple, deeply troubling, extraordinarily powerful in the way it revises and challenges the long-standing suppositions, ideas of the Western semiotic tradition. He deals with this question. He deals with this, the fact that it's important that we don't identify the notion of the concept with meaning. If you identify concept and meaning, then you're simply forgetting the other part of the sign. What happened to the sound image? So you have a coin with two sides. Neither side will do. You can't have one side without the other. That coin only, you can only spend that coin, it only has value. And Saussure will actually use this kind of economic metaphor to clarify what he's trying to say, if you have both sides. And he says that right here. He says, our definition of the linguistic sign poses an important question of terminology. I call the combination of a concept and a sound image a sign, but in current usage, the term generally designates only a sound image, a word, for example. And this is correct, right? In popular use, if you're driving down the street and you say, oh, did you see the sign for Shirinje? You're asking about the emblem, right? The image, the word printed on a sign that you can see with your senses, which then allows you to make the translation, that's the place I'm trying to get to. Saussure takes pains to indicate here that he's not using the word sign in that limited notion, in which case it would only be associated with the sound image, right? The sensory element, the external image. He's not using the word sign the way we talk about road signs. He's using the word sign to talk about this binary entity, which is like no entity we've ever seen before. An entity which is not a thing, but a relational mechanism. Yeah.
But is it really different? Like the way we use sign to mean road signs, for example, the Shirinja sign or stoplights, or because like, for example, the sign to Shirinja, when we look at it, it wouldn't make any sort of sense to us if the concept of the village in Shirinja didn't exist. Like,
sure.
So
or
like,
what signs do, right? We know
yeah,
that
exactly.
Signs point
like,
to things,
exactly.
or places, or
so
ideas.
like calling that a sign, like it's actually like I think the concept is inherent in that sign because we know that the village exists, or like the fact that there's a sign for a village indicates to us that it exists, even if we hadn't heard of it before.
Sure.
So.
And Saussure is just trying to emphasize that he wants us to remember that relationality, that binary aspect, that it's not just the material or sensory aspect of language that he has in mind when he talks about the sign, right? He's using the sign really in a way that hadn't been used before, in this binary relational sense, as an associative bond between two entities, rather than any one of those entities, right? Now he says, okay, maybe he says we need to find something more economical, more rhetorically effective than talking about concepts and sound images. And this is where he borrows. He's writing, of course, in French, French-speaking Swiss linguist, and instead of using the word concept, he says let's call the concept signified, and let's call the sound image signifier, right? And this is where he comes up with with that term. So he comes up with this. In French, the French can be helpful here. Signifier. And signifiant. Okay, a couple of points just about this famous digraph, which has become sort of this fetishistic totemic page in modern linguistics. First, I've always thought this is Saussure's retelling of the creation myth. This is his beginning of the world in ovum. These are little eggs from which will spring the new theory of meaning in the West. I always thought there was something kind of interesting, even on a graphic level or an illustrative image, about this kind of egg-like womb producing meaning. And it's interesting also that the signified is always on top, the signifier on the bottom. Even if the arrows suggest that we need relationality in both directions, still there's a persistent tendency that's inevitably at work in this kind of discourse, that in the end where we're getting to, where we're going, our destination, our homeland is the signified, right? The concept, the idea, the place that we're trying to get to. The material, sensory element is still the vehicle for arriving there. So just when we thought we had escaped from the old traditional claims and terms of semiotics, they're back in place in a way that almost seems inevitable. So these are terms that Saussure borrows from the history of semiotics in the West. He says they're good, noble terms with history. But by virtue of using them, it's interesting, it might have been more helpful, or it might have said something different if Saussure had come up with entirely different terms. He'd come up with a new word that didn't have the kind of historical baggage, the connotations and associations that link these terms back to the history of hermeneutics from Sophocles to Augustine, right, that we've been tracing already this morning. Another point of just the reason why I'm giving you the French here, signifier, signifiant, right? So the signifier, that which is signified, right? The result of an action. Signifiant, present participle. The signifying entity, that which is signifying, that which signifies, the signifier. The very terms that Saussure uses re-emphasize the kind of traditional trajectory of meaning, if I can put it that way. The traditional directionality of meaning, where we begin with a vehicle, a process that's moving us somewhere. I'm signifying, I'm at the signified. I'm there. I'm in Shirinje, right? I'm on the road going to Shirinje. I got there. Signifier. It's done. It's the active, it's the end of a process, isn't it? Signifier. So even the grammatical structures that Saussure uses here, in some sense, challenge or sort of return Saussure back towards the traditional semiotics that he's been trying to critique. Does that make sense, what I'm saying here? Okay. How are we doing in terms of...
Maybe we can take a break, because we're almost halfway.
We're almost halfway. Okay, let's see, where are we? Let me just see if there's anything on this particular subject.